I'm Bob Carroll. I'm the Executive Vice President at Permanent Solutions Labor Consultants and your host for today's episode of Employee Relations Words of Wisdom. I'm joined today by Brandon Grysko, an attorney at Fausone Bohn. Brandon, how you doing today?
Hey, good, Bob. Thanks for having me. Fausone Bohn is one of the premier law firms in Wayne County servicing businesses and individuals, and thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Yes, and Brandon, real quick, what areas do you practice?
So I focus on labor and employment law, representing HR leaders and business owners, labor relations professionals, and various labor and employment issues.
Very good. And I asked Brandon to address a question that I received from a comment from one of our Words of Wisdom posts that we put out a couple weeks ago. And the question was, and the way it was put was, my company is moving, it's a unionized company, and it said, my company is moving within a 50-mile radius. Does that mean that we can get rid of our union? And I asked Brandon to come on and talk real quickly about that. And what would your answer be to that individual?
Boy, wouldn't it be great if you could just move and leave the union behind?
It's not that easy, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. When you move, especially when it comes to moving a short distance like that, the union's going to come with you as a business.
Yes, and the right answer is, if the employees don't want a union, they do have an avenue out, but it is a difficult journey, which would be a decertification. What would you say? Decertifications are very, very tough. And if you're an employer and you know that your employees don't want a union, that a majority don't want a union, you go through that process. Can you briefly discuss what decertification means?
Well, decertification would be an election that the NLRB would oversee, and essentially would constitute a vote of the employees that they no longer want to be represented by the union, who up until that point, of course, is the exclusive bargaining representative for the employees in the covered unit.
But I started my career, Brandon, I don't know if you know this, but I started my career by decertifying a union. That's what really got me engrossed in the subject of labor and some of the things that happened when we were unionized, and I helped unionize this particular company. And ironically, I'm the one that got out because I did realize what happens in the inner workings of the union. You and I both have similar backgrounds where we dealt with, we were in public sector unions. You were a police officer, I was a firefighter. And tell me, did you see the same difference that I saw between the public sector and the private sector?
I think there is a big difference between the public and private sectors, and particularly because I don't think, at least not in public safety unions particularly, when you start talking about clerical technical type workers, you may see some additional differences even within the public sector. But for the public safety unions, being police and fire, I do think that generally there's more camaraderie, there's more public acceptance, and additionally, pretty much all of your union officials were themselves, at least in my experience, former police officers or former firefighters, which I think adds to the relatively good relationship that the employee has with the union officials in that context.
And it's very, very rare, if ever, in the public sector that you go through a decertification, but it does happen in the private sector. And for those of you that don't know how the process works, the whole process is employee driven, correct?
Yes.
Yes,
that's right. So it all has to start with the employees being dissatisfied with the union, and at that point, steps can be taken to initiate the decertification process.
So from my experience, when I started the decertification process, and it was a lot harder back then, I'm showing my age, but we were still using baud dial-up modems and did not have Google and did not have the internet resources we have now. I had to do all the research myself, make a trip down to the NLRB just to get an idea of what I could do, and spend a lot of time in libraries. And what was very striking to me once I got the ball rolling is that even though I thought that I was doing something that would make management, very hyper aware and proud of what I was doing, I was avoided at all costs. In fact, if the president of the company would walk down the hallway and see me, he'd turn around and walk the other way. Can you explain why it was that way?
I think to some extent the company, of course, wants to avoid looking as though they're interfering with any rights that may be protected under the National Labor Relations Act. And so obviously, you, as an employer, you can't interfere with those rights, the right to unionize, the right to have a bargaining representative of your choosing. And so I think the fear of the impropriety and the way that may look going forward probably had something to do with that.
Yeah, and I would say looking back and after everything's done and dust is settled many, many years later, I can't blame former management of that company from walking away from me because it was such a tight-knit group. If they were even seen talking to me, all they have to do is make a UOP charge and make it a lot more difficult for me to accomplish my goal. I was just a regular employee at the time.
Right.
And I did go through a lot of grief. I had my tires slashed twice during that summer. I had people following me home that still to this day, they weren't my coworkers. But no physical harm was ever done to me. I did have people threaten me. It's a very
scary stuff.
It's a difficult process, and people don't realize that when they get into the union, that it is very difficult to get out. With that said, it still happens, and it's very important that people know and understand that them as employees have the right to do it, but also expect that you're not going to get support from the company. They're not going to pay for an attorney like you to help the employees.
Right. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Right. And at the same time, the union the union is going to make a business decision at the end of the day. You know, if once I started getting enough signatures, I did see the union start to back off a bit and decide that, hey, I'm winning, they're losing. And eventually the union did withdraw, and we were able to go back to being union free, and our company thrived. In fact, we went from 9 ambulance companies to, I believe, 13 ambulance companies after that happened. So I guess
well, that's great. And how did you?
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, did you notice a difference in wages and benefits between when you were represented by the union and when you went union free?
So this is what happened. I got wind, and the whole reason that I went for the decertification, Brandon, is once I got in, you know, I helped to organize. I was out there talking to my coworkers every day, and you know the phrase "loose lips sink ships." Well, I happened to walk in on a meeting where I got wind that they wanted to get the employees to agree to $1 an hour pay cut. Now, this is EMS back in the early 2000s, and we were making maybe $8.50 an hour at the time, and that's a huge cut. That's an absolutely huge cut for someone that's in a profession that isn't in it for the money to begin with, but you still have to eat. You still have to
not to mention the level of responsibility where you're literally carrying and potentially able to push enough drugs to either bring somebody back to life or potentially end their life.
Absolutely. But when I found out that they were going to make that cut, Brandon, I started my steps towards the decertification. Their only interest was organizing other ambulance companies in the area. There was a brand new union offset of the SEIU called the International Association of EMTs and Paramedics. In fact, I believe we were the second organizing attempt from that union. So to this listener or to this viewer that sent the question, no, you cannot get rid of the union just because you move. Your employer cannot close down to get rid of a union. In fact, Brandon, that's an unfair labor practice, correct?
Yeah, any intentional act that is particularly targeted towards getting rid of the union, it could potentially be an unfair labor practice. And not only is it a nightmare in terms of having to pay legal fees and things like that are often not covered by insurance, but it's also a PR nightmare, particularly when now the union can go to the press and say that, hey, this company is doing things unfairly and unlawfully.
So just I want to get some clarification on this. So just for everybody watching, if you are an owner of a company, a president of a company, a manager, but preferably you want to deal with HR, somebody higher up. If you are approached by an employee and asked, can we get rid of our union? You have every right as a leader to direct them to the resources to get information. My thing is this, I would make it very, very clear. You cannot assist them in any way other than directing them to the resources. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say anytime an employer takes a position in a union campaign, especially in decertification, there's definitely a risk of running into a ULP for interference with protected rights under the NLRA.
Yes. So I hope that answers the question that was brought to me. And I love it when people bring questions, so I can get people like Brandon on here to answer specific questions. So Brandon, I thank you for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me, Bob. I really appreciate it. And if anybody needs anything, feel free to reach out. And happy to answer more questions.
So just so everybody knows, I just finished a video with Brandon, and Brandon offered to put my contact information up on the end of his video. Brandon, I'm going to reciprocate the offer to you as well. At the end of this video, you'll find my contact information, and you'll also find Brandon's contact information. And if you have any questions regarding unions, employee relations, labor relations, contract negotiations, feel free to reach out. Remember, we're consultants. Brandon's an attorney. We have our own different approaches in dealing with certain matters, and we're both here and available to help you with your needs.
Thanks, Bob.
Brandon, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Employee Relations Words of Wisdom.